An honest man lies at rest, the friend of man, the friend of truth, the friend of age, the guide of youth. Few hearts like his with birth you warmed, few heads with knowledge so informed. If there is another world, he lives in bliss. If there is none, he made the best of this. Robert Burns. Robert Burns was a Scotsman, not an Irishman. If he were an Irishman, he would know that there is a hereafter. And Pete did live to the fullest. Please permit me to share a few stories with you. What was it like growing up with Pete Diskin? My closest friend, my best man at my wedding. I'd like to answer a few questions, if I could, that you might like to know. One, how did he come about having an encyclopedic memory? How did he become a Philadelphia Phillies fan?
That's a question.
Could have been amazing.
Was he always going to be a teacher and an educator? I hear some things you didn't know. He was one of the first activists. You wouldn't think of Pete as an activist.
No,
He was
that
an
I
activist.
knew. That I knew. I talked to him.
Did you know of his early appreciation of rock and roll music? So let me tell you a few stories. It all begins for me in the 3rd grade in Miss Cullen's class at St. Elizabeth's High School, St. Elizabeth's Grammar School in Linden, New Jersey, where we were students assigned by geography. At that time, there was overcrowding in the
Unknown
school,
caller.
so I was not in Pete's class as a 1st grader or a 2nd grader. We had actually shifts. Some went to school in the morning, some went to school in the afternoon. Finally, the town was big enough so they created another parish on the other side, in the Sunnyside section of town, which basically made it so that there was a bifurcation. So that meant that Pete came into my class that I was in, and we were living 2.5 miles apart from each other, 2.5 blocks apart from each other, and separated only by 2 things. The junior high school field, which was really, when I call it a field, it was a sandlot. And then Dobson Park. So you'll hear a lot about Dobson Park. For those of us who grew up around Dobson Park, this was a magnet to the town. For the next 10 years, we spent countless hours competing, collaborating, schmoozing, and scheming. If it was the 1950s, our parents and our parents' friends knew each other, trusted each other, and trusted us to be able to embrace a value system where honesty, integrity, and fair dealings were at the core. Should I add sacrifice? And before that, hard work and a belief in education as a means to a greater life. There were no trust fund kids in our neighborhood. You towed the mark, both in class and out of class. Pete's father was a man of very few words. He either liked you or he didn't like you. His mother, on the other hand, had a warmth, a welcoming, and a style like no other. A lot like you, Mary, in a lot of ways. Okay. She was very empathetic, a quality that is one that Pete had for his entire life. His desire to care was at the center of his being. Pete's sister, Kathleen, my sister that I never had. I was an only child, like you, Mary. Kathleen was something that only God could create in an environment that grew up with very competitive young men. Kathleen was a champion at virtually everything that she did. And I say that, we could never beat her. We were beaten her by horseshoes. Okay, no matter what sport it was, Kathleen predominated. Now, when it came down to other things that were competitive about around Dobson Park, understood that there were other games that kept our attention during the summer months. I shared this just a little while ago. The predecessor to cornhole, which you throw and toss something, is quoits, which is a metal object with a hole in the middle, pretty heavy, about 5 pounds. And the county champion was Pete Diskin. Okay, the horseshoe champion in the county, this is Union County, a big county, okay, was Kevin. Okay. However, if you asked him to play paddle ball, or if you asked him to do some of the other things around, he was not so good. And he admitted to that. Okay. She was the sister I never had, except for one other sister sitting at this table that I had forgotten, was a friend of ours, reminiscent of a time when we 5 guys called ourselves the Big Five, and we played basketball. Now, understood that basketball back then was not the basketball of today. However, we would challenge anyone, and among that was John Dabrowskis, Barbara's brother, who went on to play at St. Francis of Loretta, Pennsylvania. Played high school ball for Alba with St. Mary's, one of the great coaches. Okay. There was Ted Zawacki, who was Ball State, went on to play at Wake Forest. Jim Duffy, who went to Carnegie Mellon. And myself, I played a little bit at Stevens Institute, small ball by any standard. Okay, and Pete. As I say, we were pretty much the Big Five, and we challenged anybody and won lots more games than we ever lost. One thing was clear: family was at the center of the Diskin universe. For Pete, how is it that he had a memory for the slightest detail and an encyclopedic mind? Well, one instance comes to mind. We were in the 8th grade. We had a tough nun by the name of Sister Marjorie. Am I right, Danny? Danny? Was she tough? But she was fair.
I'm still here healing from the scars, mental and physical.
She was great on discipline. For me, she was a great teacher, and better yet, she was an educator. She taught Pete and I how to be able to stand on our own 2 feet, but she trusted us. So one day, she decided that we should be crossing guards for the young kids who often would go home for lunch. And so Pete would then challenge me with questions about geography, and I would challenge him about questions in history. And it was stump the stars at an early age. Okay, to a point where in graduation, when there was a medal awarded at the end of graduation in the 8th grade, he won the history award and I won the geography award. No surprise. We had an opportunity to challenge ourselves about many subjects. Yeah, history and geography, but some of the questions were even more important when we came down to the competitiveness of life. And there was one instance, I didn't think I was going to tell this, but I think it's important that I do. Sister Marjorie thought that maybe Pete and I should be, I'll call them snoops. We had some 4 or 5 bad guys in the class. They were all tall, they sat in the back. Okay, I could mention them by name, but to protect their innocence or lack of I dare not do that. Okay, slander is something that I take very seriously. But anyway, at least 1 or 2 of them were pretty much miscreants of a type that. So now this is where administration comes into play. Pete and I decided we're not going to be rats. We're not going to be snoops. What we're going to do is we're going to sit down with these 5 guys, and we're going to tell them that we're there for a reason. We got put here to watch you. We're going to tell you that right off the bat. Now, what we want you to do is to toe the mark, because if you don't toe the mark, it's on you, not necessarily on us. With that, with the exception of one student, again, to be remain nameless, who managed to find out that he needed to find more time in the principal's office than he did in the classroom, Pete was forgiving of the first time that you did something wrong, and so was I, but not the second. So you got one chance, And with that, we were able to have the kind of thing that I think stood him well in life, which was basically to point to students that he had, some of which I understand. He used to have to go and pull out from this very facility before he became Vincenzo's, to pull them out of school and whatever. Am I correct on this?
You're correct. I experienced it firsthand.
There's another reason I became encyclopedic, and I only thought about this at 4 o'clock this morning. There was a time when, and our love of baseball really come into this picture. Pete watched a lot of the games on TV as I did growing up on our black and white televisions. Okay, and one of them was a game on WPIX in which at the end of the game they asked a question, and that is, how can you still have 6 hits in an inning and score 3 outs, but don't score a run? Pete knew the answer. He called up WPIX, and the prize was the Encyclopedia of Baseball. So he won the Encyclopedia of Baseball by knowing. Now that's a story I thought of at 4 o'clock this morning.
I have that book.
That book should be cherished.
There you go.
Now we also collected baseball cards. Now, this is a 1952 baseball card. Each of us had an opinion about the teams we rooted for. We lived in the golden age. We had Mickey Mantle for the Yankees in center field, we had Duke Snider for the Dodgers, and we had my Willie Mays in center field for the New York Giants. But he had Richie Ashburn in center field for the Philadelphia Phillies. Okay, and we used to then have to argue who was the best center fielder. And he would then take out the back of the baseball cards, and there were 407 cards in the 1952 set. He memorized the backs of the baseball cards.
Right on his mind.
That's how he became encyclopedic. That's how he was able to take students in a class, know where you sat, what your names were. It was all something cultivated during a lifetime of a curious mind, actually looking to be able to sense what should be the right thing to do at any point in time. I dare say that was not the full story of the Phillies. There were, as I said, over 400 cards, but there were also times when we needed to be able to figure out what it is that each team should provide us with as fans. So when we lived in an atmosphere where the Dodgers and the Giants, the Dodgers and the Yankees were predominant in our neighborhood. The Giants were in the minority in terms of leading for the New York Giants, and the Phillies were certainly in the minority. And in 1951, when the Giants were 13 and a half points games behind the Dodgers, we went to a game, a not-hole game, because it was provided by Wendy Boyerfart, who was the director of recreation in Linden, and he would arrange these trips so that once a week you got to go to a ball game. So we used to sit above the bullpen in Polo Grounds, and you'd watch the pitchers eventually pitch, and at some point in the game, you'd yell down some things to the pitchers. Well, it turned out that day the Giants caught the Dodgers in the first game 11-4, and I could even see the home runs that basically were being hit in that game that made that the turning point for their season, and the rest is history when they beat the Dodgers on the last day with the home run thrown by Ralph Branca and hit by Bobby Thompson that shot her around the world. I relayed that story later on to Bobby Thompson before he died some years back. But the point I'm making with regard to the Phillies, the not-hole games were sometimes ones where, for luck, we would see the Dodgers play the Phillies. And the Dodgers never could figure out one player that played for the Phillies. His name was Swish Nicholson, who was there from the Cubs. Okay, and every time he swung, the Dodger rooters would go swish, swish, with the hope that he'd strike out. Every time that Pete and I went to a game, Swish Nicholson hit a home run on the Bedford Avenue, and we saw 4 home runs, and he beat the Dodgers 4 times in a single year at Evans Field. That was enough to start him thinking about, maybe I should become a Phillies fan. Now, there were other stories there that you probably know, Joe, that make him a little bit more interested in the Phillies as time went on, too. But that was Pete. He lived for the underdog.
That's right.
That was important. He rooted for the
For
underdog.
the underdog, yeah.
And that meant the same thing in life. If you were a student and you weren't necessarily doing all that well, he tried to help you. That was Pete. Caring. A human being who had a humanity about him and care. And I would say that some of the code that basically he lived by is a great code, which basically is that not to know something is one thing. Not to want to know is worse. Not to think or to hope is unthinkable, but not to care is indefensible. So he lived by a code which I think stood him well for his entire life. He was the same person at the end that he was at the beginning.
Thank you, Lord.
There's one other story that I have to report. Maybe there are a couple. Well, there's one. There's a classic
Good all
matchup.
night.
Linden hosted a Union County track meet. And each part of the county sent in their runners to run in a 60-yard dash at what is now Cooper Field, but was then called the Athletic Heat. Pete won his heat, I won my heat, there were 4 other heats, and now the 6 of us, the winners, are gonna basically square off against each other. Okay, so I look to the left, Pete's in the first lane, I'm in the 6th lane, I look down, the starting pistol is gonna go off, and the next thing I see, a hoofs running in front of me, okay? Pete and I tied for last. The runner to my left was John Moon. John Moon
No wonder.
was one of the fastest human beings. In fact, in a race for 100 yards, John Moon beat Bob Hayes, who became a Dallas Cowboy and was at that time considered the fastest human being on the planet.
Wow, that's pretty cool.
The other person in this was a player from Plainfield. His name was Bill Campbell. Bill Campbell became the decathlon champion of the United States and won the
Not too
Olympics
shabby,
in
huh?
Melbourne in 1956. So Pete and I had the pleasure of being able to say that we raced with John Moon and Bill Campbell. The best. Nothing but the best. Well, as time went on, we had to talk a little bit about competitiveness. He was a winner. Joe will attest to this. Maybe not. In stickball, we never lost. In fact, we got to a point where nobody wanted to play us. 5 years behind St. Lee's.
I don't remember quite that.
I don't ever remember you and Paul Mattini ever winning.
I don't remember us ever losing.
There's a difference here.
The march
He
of
was no
time.
jump man. He couldn't even throw the ball.
He threw what was the original slider. It wasn't even called a slider. I don't know what it was, but it came at you pretty fast. I threw junk.
It was a rubber ball.
It was a Spalding high bounce or Pennsylvania pinky. Those were the 2 balls that we basically played. But we played incessantly from morning to night. In basketball, we probably, as I said before, we were the big 5 and we were pretty indefensible. But the point is that one thing that was characteristic of Pete, foul was foul and fair was fair. It was that simple. And when we played as a team, if we threw the ball to each other, whoever had the better shot, that's who's going to basically score. It was a team effort. Right? I think that's how he lived his life. He lived as a team player. Never one person over another. That's a characteristic that stood him well through his entire life. It's one of the reasons why he's one of the most cherished friends I could ever say that I was privileged to know. So now, when I look at where we are, it's clear that God had a purpose for people. He had a purpose for